gets the most down into, I think, the central issue in the culture, and it's definitely more heady. It definitely gets more into topics that are a little bit hard to think about. Hopefully, I laid it out. This has been kind of a work in progress for me over a number of years to try to figure out how to lay this all out and what exactly it looks like, the knowledge, how knowledge has become what it is in Western society, and what are the ways in which it got there. It really gets to your question, Brother Natty, too, about you mentioned about how did we get here, and a lot of people ask that. And so I've tried over a number of years to try to consolidate that. I did an independent study at Biola with Dr. Scott Smith, who's awesome, and I focused on this topic. And then I've added a lot to it as I've studied for the PhD with philosophy of science, and I've studied a lot for my philosophy degree. So this is the latest iteration of this, and really I'm building on this, hopefully eventually to do a philosophy PhD on this topic, because I think it's so central to the problem we're talking about how culture has been sort of given over to a secular mindset. And it's this issue of knowledge. And so this one is about tracing philosophical roots of scientism, and renewing the Christian voice, especially in terms of science and technology. So that's what this one will focus on. And we'll start off with J.P. Moreland, this video from him.
So tell me, scientism and secularism, what prompted you to write a book length treatment on this subject?
It's just always a delight to be with you, Lenny. It's we've been friends for a long time and co-laborers in the mission. I was deeply burdened by something that I saw in the church and in culture. And that was that there was a set of ideas that were at the very bottom of the Christian retreat from culture, and was also at the bottom of fomenting the cultural chaos and political chaos that we're seeing today, and nobody knew what it was. It's in the drinking water. People have simply absorbed it and guide their lives on the basis of this ideology, but they had never heard the name and had no idea of how to respond to it. And so I said to myself, somebody needs to address this.
Yeah, so that language of it's in the drinking water is really important here, because sometimes people will say, like, why should we care about philosophy? They'll say, like, isn't this a lot of thinking? Like, doesn't the Bible tell us to have faith? And so why are we trying to think so deep and read so many books about what's happening? And the issue is that these things, this overarching philosophical worldview that the culture has, it's been built over a number of years, and even Christians who grow up in the society will think this way. And J.P. Moreland's really big on this. That's why he said it's in the water. We think in a scientism sort of way. We respond to people in society in that kind of way. We give precedence to scientific sort of findings a lot of times over moral or religious, Christian truth that comes from Christianity. We treat them differently, and we treat them differently because we grow up in a culture that thinks this way. So hopefully today we're looking at science, but as I'll talk through, science actually really connects. Science just means to know. That's like the original meaning of it. So science really connects into the whole idea of what we know. And there was a shift to where it went from science as one of the things to where science became the thing. And that's what J.P. Moreland is talking about with scientism. And this scientism has sort of been absorbed into our culture. So this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the philosophical shift, how Western thought moved from a united, intelligible cosmos, or what I'll talk about is like the grand system we talked a little bit about during the art session, to today's crisis of certainty, the rise of reductionism or atomistic knowledge. So how did we come to a state of where we think of knowledge from kind of building up from the bottom up. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, where that'll make sense in a couple of slides. The challenge to science, how modern physics, quantum physics, and design science, they complicate the materialist view. So there is science, there is a way of thinking, there's a scientism, and then there are challenges to scientism. And these challenges to scientism actually lead into postmodernism and critical theories and things like that. So we'll see that too, about how it all flows from the cultural story, that we have this modernism, this scientism, then we have the sort of failure of science to meet the need of being the one source of knowledge. And then that led into this sort of absurdity where the things like postmodernism, where truth, there is no truth, it's just my truth, can kind of come in. Then the cultural response. We'll talk about something that's called the Great Retreat. And this is from a book, I think it's called like Fundamentalism in America. I mentioned it a couple of different times. There's a lot of, J.P. Moreland is big on this book. And I think it helps draw the picture about what happened in our universities pretty well. And then thinking about the Inklings too. And so that's the Lewis and Tolkien group at Oxford that they had, and how they responded to where science, a lot of this stuff was sort of up and coming when they had their group. And then finally, we'll be talking about Alvin Plantinga's argument about how the Christian worldview actually provides the best grounds for science and technology. And naturalism actually doesn't provide grounds for science and technology. So it's a lot to cover. We're going to try to cover it all today. Sticking with Paul Gould's framework, we live in a disenchanted world. The perception of reality as mundane and merely mechanical. So that's the way people think today. There used to be this enchanted worldview of where, creation, it was a wonderful thing to be in. And then at some point, this mechanism, this scientism, and these things have caused people to be unenchanted. And so, people are very nihilistic. And so we're trying to show people that Christianity is good, and trying to re-enchant people with the fact that this is a good creation that God has created us in. The three bridges, so reason, goodness, and beauty, those are his three things. So we're always thinking about those here, about the cultural conversation. So I'm gonna let Raphael in. Hey, Raphael. So yeah, those are the three ways Paul Gould reasons it. Science must be shown to reveal the glory of God, beauty. Technology must be guided by human dignity, goodness, and not just efficiency, truth. So that's just kind of a statement about how this integrated Christian view of knowledge actually can add another dimension that is really needed for science and technology. So we're going to start out. We're really going to just move through the timeline, starting with basically the Greek philosophers in the early church, and then moving into how did science come in, and how did that view change, the view of knowledge change, that led sort of into the modern situation we're in. And I think you'll see as we go along what is the answer to this. So the medieval sort of thinking and also the Greek philosophic thinking are very similar, because the earliest Christians, they saw Plato and Aristotle as providing a really robust, good framework for knowledge and reason. And so there's a really similarity in their thinking, and it's a similarity with the Bible, that the world is inherently intelligible. Knowledge comes from empirical observation. So that's Aristotle. Saw that if you investigated reality, you could know things. And actually, what was at the foundation of Aristotle's belief, him and his teacher Plato and Socrates, they believed that there was one God, that the rest of the gods are sort of this false thing, that it was something that people believed in, but it wasn't really true. And they believed there was this sort of one creator God that everything came from in some way. And so this actually led to the school with Plato and Aristotle to really have a high confidence in knowledge. They really believed you could learn about the world. And Aristotle wrote volumes and volumes on plants, on all kinds of different things. They say he's sort of like the original father of science. We have Augustine that comes later, after Christianity comes into Rome around 330 AD or so. And Augustine also wrote a lot. He tied knowledge as being rooted in divine illumination. So God is revealing things. That's why we can know, because God has revealed things. He's made us so that we can see them. Certainty is transcendent. So certainty, our ability to be certain, is tied to the fact that God exists. So because God exists, because he has made us to be able to understand truth, that is where we get our certainty from. That's the reason that we have certainty within the Augustine sort of framework. It's a byproduct of being made by a good creator. Aquinas, really, he was very systematic. And Aquinas, we're jumping now like 900 years, because Aquinas, or even longer than that, about 1,000 years, because Aquinas was writing in about 1200 AD. But he synthesized faith and reason. He came up with what's called natural theology, and talked about its knowledge begins with the senses, but ultimately points to the logos of God, about who God is. So we have this natural knowledge that we get from the senses, but it points to the fact that there's a divine creator, because we're able to explore, we're able to know what kind of creatures we are. That it shows we were created by a God that wants us to know about the universe. And so at this time, the premise was knowledge starts with faith. So you start with faith because you have faith that you internally know, you know through scripture that God has made you, and then that gives certainty that he has made us to know creation. And so that from that certainty, we begin to explore the world. And then I call this the grand system, because the question is, how does this new phenomena fit into the story of reality? And so that's what they're always asking. Like in Aquinas's work, he's stretching out and talking about, well, everything he's talking about when he's talking about angels, or he's talking about creation, everything is fitting into a big story about God has made reality. So why did he make these different kinds of angels? Why did he make people this way? Why did he make nature this way? How does it all fit together? And so it's sort of like a big puzzle that starts with a high degree of confidence that God has made all of this. And then, so we jump a little bit forward from Thomas Aquinas, about 100 years, and we have William of Ockham. And so J.P. Moreland and also Scott Smith over at Biola University and some others believe that a lot of the issue actually started with Ockham, although it didn't set in right away. So William of Ockham has something he developed called nominalism. And what he's really famous for is Occam's razor. A lot of people have heard of that. Occam's razor basically means that you go for the simplest explanation. And this was like groundbreaking in the work that he did. So he denied the reality of universals. In other words, he said that we shouldn't know things. We shouldn't try to say, this thing is blue because blue is this concept that's out there. Instead, we start from the lower level, and then we reason up. So whatever phenomenon, he believed that God created us to be able to explore the world, and whatever you look at, whatever thing you're investigating or thinking about. And he was really big about nature and talking about the beauty of nature. He was a monk, and he was praising God through talking about it, but he would always start out with, he would say, you can only say, basically, you should only say like the most simple thing you could say about a thing. You should only, if you can explain, a bird, going here to there based on looking for food, then that's all you should say. And he thought that was a way of, that God was simple, this divine simplicity thing, and that doing that was sort of honoring to God, and it was also being respectful about what we can know, not going beyond that. And so this kind of idea of, instead of trying to take a look about how things fit into the big system, the grand system, and instead looking at this or that thing, this or that particular thing, and saying, well, what can I just know just by studying this thing? And then building up from there. Started really with Occam. And so he mentioned that he had a writing on that. It wasn't super popular at his time, but once science started to sort of develop, once you get more into rationalism in the 1600s, where there was a greater access to a lot of these Greek sort of documents, and the printing press and those things were starting to come about. That's when you really started to see Occam's way of thinking sort of set in. Rene Descartes, we talked about him a few times with rationalism. And so what Rene Descartes did is he came into the age of where people were starting to, they started to, look at deism. Science was starting to become big. People were really into mathematics in Rene Descartes' day. And he was also, he was a mathematician. And so he looked at the world and he tried to make a defense of God's existence. But starting out, he said, I'm going to start out from the position that I can know nothing. And then I'm just going to build up from there. And that's that I think, therefore I am. And so you can see how he took Occam's sort of position, but about himself. And he said, well, I'm not going to say anything. And then he sort of tries to build up a case for God's existence from like the very ground up. Just saying, I'm just going to say that I don't have any confidence in anything. I can't know anything. And then what can I know? I at least can know that I exist. And then he tries to go from I exist up and taking this sort of route. Francis Bacon is really known as the father of science. He invented what is called inductivism. And so this is it's knowledge starting with the five senses. And you can kind of see that evolving from what Descartes was saying. But with Francis Bacon, you have him saying, well, we explore the world through induction. We can use our five senses. And then just on that basis of saying, what I can know based on my five senses and maybe doing an experiment, I can build up that knowledge. And, this is basically what, Isaac Newton was doing with, the story about the apple that fell down from the tree. Hey, there's this force, and then you try a few different things. Hey, it happens whenever I do this. There's this gravity thing. And so using your five senses to just test to see what you can know about reality. And then David Hume is, that's his picture there. And he is a skeptic, and he's a famous skeptic. I mean, still scientists and all kinds of philosophers will refer to him today because he really brought up a big sort of problem when you think, according to sort of the inductivism that Francis Bacon and others are making. What he said is you can't posit causes and effects. You can't say that one thing always causes another thing. And his famous example was with black ravens. And he said, if you see one black raven today, that doesn't tell you anything about ravens in general, because there's no principle that you can draw. He said, you can't name a principle that tells you that the next raven is going to be black. And he said, this doesn't change even if you saw 100 ravens. There's no principle you can lay out, like a logical principle. You can say this, therefore this, that tells you that the rest of the ravens will be black. And so you can think about that for a minute, but that's sort of a hard problem. And he said that it's basically this habit, that we just out of habit think that we can posit that something causes something else. But actually all we can really say is this particular raven is black. And we have to kind of leave it at that. So this sort of thinking of we can only know things from the ground up, our knowledge is really limited, you're sort of just building one little brick on top of another brick based on what you can learn with your five senses. This sort of came in at this time, especially in the 16 and 1700s. And this is what a lot of people refer to as sort of the Enlightenment. that this came in. And so the question went from sort of how do you fit this into this grand system to what can I deduce about this phenomena from my sense experience? And so this leads to two different ways of thinking, atomistic versus relational, right? And you may have gotten this so far, but atomistic is reductionism, understanding a thing, like the scientist down there at the bottom is breaking it down to its smallest, simplest components. And then once you understand the smallest part of it, then you can sort of go up one layer and understand a little bit more about how those small things work together. And your knowledge is always just, it's very limited. You're just building up one little thing at a time. Its focus is on empirical facts. So things you can know with a really, really high degree of certainty that you can explore with your sense experience, not things that are abstract. And then the whole is merely a sum of the parts. So, and that's obviously part of this. Before, in medieval ages, and really all the time before that, with Aristotle, starting probably with Aristotle and within the Bible and the Old Testament, knowledge had a lot more to do with that grand system. And so it's integration. Whenever you run into a new phenomenon, you're trying to understand, knowing the purpose and place of that thing within God's order, systematic creation. And so meaning, value, teleology, what is the purpose of something is what teleology means. The value of a thing comes from its role in the greater system. So it has a value. Something can have a value within this way of thinking because it has value because it was created. And so you can see in these two different ways. One way you're really building up. It's hard to really get anywhere because you're only allowing that next step to be, what you can show empirically, what you can test with your sense perceptions, and you can know in that sort of way. Whereas the other one, you start out with a lot. You start in the beginning, there's a lot. You know that God exists, you know that you're able to know reality because of that. You can have confidence in that way of knowing. You know that everything else has been created by that same God, good God that created you. And so you can start to think about things with a lot to start with. And so it allows you to sort of have this fitting things together perspective. A typical example of this difference is something that you probably heard in science class, is under the reductionist view, people see color as basically meaningless. Because what scientists will say is that, and in postmodernism, they love this example, is color is just our eyes reacting to the way light hits things. Basically, light hits a thing in a certain way. The thing itself doesn't have a color. It just happens to reflect light that way, and we happen to see it that way. So it doesn't say anything about that thing. So color is basically this meaningless thing that just happens to be the way that we see. But when you take it from an integrated view of knowledge, like Christians, we tend to see color and as part of God's tapestry, that God has made things colorful. He's given things a specific color for a specific reason. There's something of beauty about it. And so that's an example of how you can see these two different ways of knowledge working in reality. And so from an apologetics perspective, the relational view of knowledge is rooted in God's logos, and it provides a coherent framework of meaning and value. It's something the atomistic reductionist approach cannot deliver. And so about morality, for instance, or about meaning and purpose, if you take an atomistic, that atomistic way of looking at knowledge, you can never say people have any meaning or purpose. You just can't get that high in your knowledge. There's nothing to connect meaning and purpose to. Morality, you can't really study in the way you can study a scientific thing in this atomistic sort of way with the five senses. And so it's very hard to say anything about it whatsoever. But we should also not just reject atomistic knowledge either, because it provides a key and important way of discovering the world. We're able to get to really certain sort of knowledge through science And that's the reason a lot of the technology and things like that we have come from that sort of view. And just the pictures over there on the right. So the bottom is the science, that sort of atomistic view. Above that is a painting called the Fall of Satan. But I included it because you can kind of see in the Middle East in the medieval times how they had this full view of this very integrated view of reality. So at the bottom you have the earth, you have these falling angels in this realm between heaven and earth. You have these guardians of heaven, these angels standing on the stars. And so that's the stars in space. And then you have like the apostles up there and Jesus and God at the top. And so there's just this, sort of layered approach. Everything is sort of layered and involved with each other within that framework and that sort of view of the world. Okay, so moving on. Now we're moving on to 18th century. And so we find something really interesting, and this is really important as Christians, I think, to think about, because I think these are the examples of people who really did what we should be trying to do today still. And what they did in the 18th century was there was an integrated view of both the older picture, the biblical picture of this sort of the grand system of thinking about how does this thing, what do I know about this thing as it relates to God's creation, but also they had a high respect for science. So Jonathan Edwards, for instance, he was the leader of the First Great Awakening in America. He graduated from Yale. He was president of New Jersey University, which turned into Princeton University. In the Great Awakening, it inspired, the founding of Dartmouth, of Columbia College, of Brown University. Like they came out of this revival. It led them to start, universities around the country. And this is because he had such an integrated love of the physics of his day. He talked about botany. He wrote long treatises about science, in addition to writing long treatises about theology. And actually, Isaac Newton was the same way. He wrote they said the majority of his writings actually was about theology. And then he also wrote about science, and his science happened to be world changing. John Wesley, I like to mention him here because he led the Methodist revival in England, a huge revival. A lot of people say that England would have went the way of the French Revolution if it wasn't for John Wesley and his work, because he went out to the people who were in the common people and he preached the gospel to them. But he was also really big in science. And so he wrote an entire thick novel, a thick book about the history of natural philosophy. And natural philosophy is just another word for science. And so he wrote out this book about, sort of the science of his day. And it was very important to him. And he saw, and he loved to think that way. And sort of this sort of integrated view led to, when you listen to John Wesley's sermons or Jonathan Edwards' sermons, you get something that is very logically in depth in the way they talk. And they're thinking about all of everything that's going on in their day. They're thinking about science, they're thinking about theology, they're thinking about sort of the technology of the day. John Wesley was writing about electricity, when it was first a thing. So thinking about all these different angles and they knew about it because they were all constantly reading. And the founding fathers of the United States were like that. I mentioned Benjamin Franklin there, but basically all of them, they had a high degree of knowledge about philosophy, a high degree of knowledge about science. They had a high degree of knowledge about political philosophy. And they were Christians. They were believers with different sort of, they're diverse in their theology, but they were Christians who also cared about all these other areas of knowledge. And so you see that sort of combined there in the 18th century. And this is when the universities in America and the West were started. The universities that exist in America and England and other places, they were started as basically like Bible colleges. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they were started, to train Christians.
Well, I remember when we visited several those founding fathers, their house, those things.
Yeah.
Really, their house is like library. The place they live, actually, the bathroom pretty small.
Yeah.
And then they, they have the farm, those orchard, those things. It's like they grow things and also study about different kind of vegetables and trees, plants. And then they have their own science lab, those things, library, books over all kinds of different topics. And they all kind of have, because our people nowadays is more like, oh, I'm a scientist. A scientist of physics, then I'm just scientist of physics. I don't know any other of those areas. But then you can see, like, because of their love for God, they go very deep on many kinds of those major areas of knowledge.
Yeah, just like Thomas Jefferson's house he has a room that's all basically like windows and, with a telescope and little inventions. He made all kinds of little inventions, and he also designed his, the whole, in Monticello, he designed like the big like temple like buildings there. So he was an architect, he was like a scientist, he was a philosopher, he was a politician. It's that this integration of knowledge. They didn't feel like they had to just stick with this or that area.
I like this last line here. It says when Christians are intellectually engaged, in depth, revival and cultural change are inevitable. It's really like this. You can compare those like the earlier revival and the later revival, like Billy Graham. Those revival, actually, the earliest one, more deeper.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so that's something to really, I want to think about that, as we go forward, because I think this is the ideal picture when we were there and the way people were thinking. But some things are going to change. So one of the changes, and this is from George Marson's Fundamentalism in American Culture, and Corey Miller also talks about this a little bit in his new book. But in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was, following the U.S. Civil War, even though a lot of the universities were founded on Christian principles, you had people started to have the debate about Darwinism, and about allowing Darwinism into the universities. You had things like the old Earth, young Earth debate that started to come in. And you had this thing called fundamentalism that was really strong in America, which was basically, instead of sort of like taking the Bible and being willing to sort of look at it and think about it, there was this acceptance of certain fundamental things. And sometimes they weren't really even biblical. It was young Earth creation was part of that. You had a lot of different things that were they were accepted, that these were true, and you will not sort of violate this. Another thing, one of those assumptions was that the Bible was basically, the ultimate book of science. And so if something wasn't in the Bible, then it wasn't true. And so you had to find some kind of justification in Scripture, not just to say that it was allowable, but that it was true. And so this, for whatever reason, led a lot of people, once you start to have the debates about Darwinism and those things, there was a great degree of teachers and thinkers at that time in the church who said, we are leaving the universities. So there was this sort of German secularism that was coming into the universities, and there were also Christians, many Christians denominations decided, well, we're not going to be in the university if Darwinism is going to be there. So there was a decision that was basically sort of to flee the mainstream universities in this country around that time period. And what this led to was a vacuum, right? You had people that were more willing to embrace secularism who were in the universities. You had people who would have been the people to fight that or stand up against that. Those people tended to leave because their denominations were saying that the universities were now an evil place. And so because of this dynamic, there was a major shift in the thinking in a lot of universities. So logical positivism is what sort of came next. And this picture is of the Vienna Circle. And so they're really famous. They were in Vienna. Some of them, like Bertrand Russell is one of them. He was English. They were a big group and in Vienna and the school there. And they wrote a lot of papers about the philosophy of science. And they were known for what's called kind of empiricism, or it's called positivism, or logical positivism is another variant of it. And basically this is the view that it's basically sort of like scientism, that only the only statements. Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. So one of the beliefs there that came from A.J. Ayer, who was part of the Vienna Circle, was that the only meaningful statements, like at all, are those that are verifiable by empirical observation or mathematical logic. And so what that means, he means like any sentence that you can't directly tie. So like if I said, there are paper towels in this room, that's something you can empirically verify. And so it's the verification principle is what the positivists were known for. It's sort of what became the main philosophy of science for a while, that any sentence needs to be verifiable by the five senses. So you can't say something about something moral, for instance, because how do you verify that? If you say that murder is evil, you can't say that. So to them, that was metaphysics, and it was nonsense. So that's literally what A.J. Ayer said in his paper. And this is the turn where I said that at this time is when we went from science being one kind of truth or one way of knowing to where we went to science was the only way of knowing. Because what they're basically saying is these other statements that people have been using for so long, they don't mean anything. They're pointless. They're useless. And so this is when scientism was defined, the philosophic belief that the methods of natural science are the only source of real knowledge. So the Vienna Circle really believed this. And science, in a lot of ways, has remained in this kind of way of thinking in a lot of ways. The philosophy of science has moved along some, but for instance, in physics, a lot of people in physics, like you'll read in like Scientific American and things like that, a lot of people in the field of physics, they still think this way. And they'll still say metaphysics and philosophy is useless. That's what Stephen Hawking said. He says it's outdated, any kind of philosophy thinking. And it was because of the Vienna Circle, it's because of positivism. And in physics, you can sort of go with positivism because you can almost have this way of thinking and get away with being a physicist, because so much of what they do has to just do with like gravity and the way physical things work with each other. For other fields of science and even for physics, there were some issues with this way of thinking. So philosophers of science pretty much right away began to challenge this belief. So Popper is famous with his principle of falsification. And basically he went with what David Hume was saying. He said, you can never say that through scientific investigation, you can never say that something is always true. You can't say that you proved gravity works this way. All you can say is you can prove that gravity doesn't work away, because you can do an experiment and you can say, hey, I showed that gravity doesn't work this way. And then that's a deductive conclusion because you've demonstrated it. But if you show that gravity, for instance, works this way at this time, Popper said, like according to Hume's principle, all you can say is gravity worked this way at that time. You can't say gravity is a principle.
Well, it sounds so scary. It's like gravity is like someone just jumped out of the building and died. Oh, but then maybe I jumped down, I wouldn't die. Maybe the gravity doesn't work this time.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's right. And that's basic. This is a big theory in science. People talk about falsification, like your theory must be falsifiable. This is like a light light version of that, because it needs to be falsifiable because it's tentative. According to Popper, all truth is tentative. It may be false. We don't really know if it's true or not. All we can know is the things that are false. You know, if you jumped out and you fell, then you can know that maybe you can prove that in that instance it's not true that you would fly or something like that. You can keep doing experiments, so you can show that other things wouldn't work in that situation, but you can never say that this is a thing that applies in more situations than just this one. Quinn is famous for he said the verification principle is not possible. Even simple words can be interpreted multiple ways. And so there are a lot of people, in terms of language, they said, to the Vienna Circle and to this existing sort of positivism philosophy, they said, well, they said simple sentences have words in them that you can't empirically verify, like the word "the." You can't empirically verify the word "the." The word "bachelor" is what Quinn uses, and I don't remember all the ways he talks about it, but he basically said it depends on what kind of sentence you're putting it in and what context, that you can use this word in multiple different ways. And so it means that you can't just there's very few sentences you can say like that whole sentence you can empirically verify what it's saying. So he showed that you need to, the way we use language, it's nonsense to say the only sentences that are meaningful, the only words that are meaningful are empirically verifiable ones. And Popper also added to this that he said, even when we do science, you have to assume a theory. So if you're doing a test about gravity, you have to sort of assume certain things about the way gravity works to be able to even get started. And you have to do a lot of reading and think about it. And not all of that is going to be directly verifiable. So they said this principle doesn't really work about verification. And then Kuhn is famous for bringing in this idea of paradigms. And so this is sort of where the idea of worldview comes from, that he said that science doesn't really work that way, according to the verifiable principle, where you think we're always just sort of making progress in some way and always discovering more truth. He said that it's really, you need to accept the method of science within a scientific community, that physicists have their own methods that they use for discovering things that they need to learn about and they need to learn how to do. And they have certain theories that they believe are true. And you need to know that. You need to work within that framework and sort of solve puzzles within that. He said discovering things outside of that kind of community of knowledge is rare. It only happens in this sort of illogical revolution, to where there starts to be a crisis, it starts to not make sense, and then someone posits a theory, and then you start a different community, a different school of thought based on that. And this is where modern scientific journals come from. This idea that there are these different communities, and then within those communities, they have certain theories they've taken on, and then everyone tries to basically disprove those theories. That's that Popper falsification. You're trying to disprove these different theories work. You're trying to do experiments to show either that it works in these different contexts or that it doesn't work. And you're trying to show that there's some issue with those theories. So this really changed the view of science from something that, we have this knowledge and we're able to go around and do induction, to this idea of, hey, science is, it has to have all this extra stuff with it in order to be able to get started. And in Kuhn, you can almost see a little bit of the, medieval sort of ages of you need a system you're working in to be able to get started. So in some ways, science has come back with Kuhn to that view of a system sort of view. There was another challenge about design science. And so this is something people don't think about. I didn't think about until I went through the philosophy of science. But actually, there's a big issue with engineering and design being a science, because if science is the only form of knowledge, what engineering is about and technology development is about building something new. And so how can you say that you know about something that doesn't exist yet, right? So scientifically, you can explore a thing from the ground up by investigating it, one piece at a time, basically. But if you don't have the thing there yet to even discover or look at, then how can that be science? And so this is something, there's a lot of actually writing the philosophy of science, but a lot of scientists basically have not accepted engineering as a true knowledge. It's seen as something sort of outside of knowledge. You're building and you're doing something, but it doesn't fit within a scientific framework. And so there's Herbert Simon is this famous Nobel laureate who tried to write out a science of the artificial, and it's really controversial because it sort of disagrees with the idea of science. But sort of the apologetic thing here is technology reveals design and purpose is inherent to human rationality. So it provides a strong point of the Christian concept of the imago Dei, that we're co-creators. We're made by a God who's a creator. We're made to be creative. And so it makes sense that we can figure out from what exists how to make new things. God is creative. God is making new things all the time. And so we as humans can figure out how to make things because we have a mind that comes from God. Science broke its own machine. So this is getting more into the idea of what happened. So you have the verification principle, and this really leads into this critical theories and postmodernism, because you had the Vienna Circle. They said science is the only form of knowledge, but you had Isaac Newton, who had classical physics, but then you had Albert Einstein who came along. And so Isaac Newton said gravity is a force, and it said that light is it's like basically like shooting a gun, that a particle goes out and then you touch the wall. Well, Albert Einstein showed that actually for gravity, you can't think about it as a force. It's not a force, because we see with black holes, it's more like a bending of space-time. And this is a really wild concept, but sort of like what the picture shows, of there's this sort of bending of space-time, and time becomes relative around heavy objects in space, and space begins to be actually sort of it's bended. There's a literal bending of time and space around large objects in space, and that's wild. But sometimes gravity will act just like a force. But when you see it with like black holes and things like that, and bigger objects, you start to see this bending happening. And so what it showed was, even though Isaac Newton had this framework that was empirically tested, that people had put this high degree of certainty in, that should have given certainty, Albert Einstein came along and completely threw out what a big part of what Newton was saying and what scientists had accepted. So it showed that science was fallible. And it also, this idea of the relativity to observer kind of got some people in the fact that there is a degree of relativity. And then what William Lane Craig writes about this is interesting, is it's objective relativity, though, is something worth noting, but because it depends on very specific conditions, this bending that's happening. Quantum theory, so quantum physics says that for really small things, for electrons, the position of the electron doesn't have a specific position. It's between two different positions until an observer looks at it through a microscope or something, through some kind of way of observing it. And once they observe it, then it has a steady position that doesn't change. So this is really wild in that it shows for very, very little things. Actually, there is a element where the observer's observation, just observing it, makes it objective from being sort of subjective. It's in two places, and then it goes to be in one place. Really wild. And so scientists are still trying to figure that out, why that happens that way. And it's led to all kinds of crazy, interesting research with quantum physics. But why do I mention this and talk about it? You know, critical theory and postmodernism come from it. Well, over on the left-hand side, Barad, who's a famous gender and science philosopher and scientist, she writes that because Bohr, who is one of the discoverers of quantum physics, one of the things he wrote about was, he said, epistemologically, or according to knowledge, we used to think that objects are independent, that they have inherent boundaries, but then that she's saying that what he showed is that a gentle realist approach, which means that a phenomena doesn't have separability from the observer. And so she took it beyond just electrons, and she said this is the way reality works, because you have to remember that for the scientific theory, it's atomistic. It's the smallest things tell us what the bigger things are like. So she said that all reality is like this in her view, that the thing itself depends on the observer. And so this is where we have interpretivism. This is what she does with, you know, her feminist science and the sort of gender studies. A lot of those things come out of this principle that she's talking about, is reality isn't objective. It's objective only as far as the connection between the observer, a specific observer, and reality. And so this led to a lot of studies that are considered science and are put in journals, but that say that you can't say something is objectively true about anything until you have an observer. So you need to you need to actually study what people are saying about different things, because you can never say that what is happening in one case for you is true for everybody. And so if you think about, you know, the sort of gender stuff that we're going through and all of that, it really comes from this principle. It comes from starting with this atomic sort of thinking and then taking it like way too far. Because the fact is, just because electrons work that way, there are plenty of objective things that we can say about reality. You know, there's plenty of things that I don't need to, you know, poll everybody in the United States to say, you know, what the on one side of the United States is the Pacific Ocean, on the other side of the United States is the Atlantic Ocean. It's a fact about reality. But because of the road, the philosophic road people went down, this made sense. This makes sense to a lot of people, and it's insane. And so this led to the Frankfurt School, which was around the same time as the Vienna Circle and continued in the 60s and 70s. And this is postmodernism, gender and feminist thought. The University of Scientific Reason was argued against. Knowledge is not neutral, right? It's a product of social systems and power structures. So you can see that from Kuhn. You know, you need all these things that come with the community to know something, and from quantum physics with Barad and these feminists, that you know, the observer-observed relationship. You need to have the observer and the observed to say anything objective. So it reduced scientific claims to social constructs. You know, what's true for me is not true for you, according to the Frankfurt School. And it challenged any authority to any fixed truth claim. Here's an example of, you know, a group that I think exemplifies how we should be thinking about Christians. So we've been, you know, thinking about what is the road to science. We've covered the road of science to today. You know, basically we're in a mix of the Frankfurt School and of the positivists and the post-positivists. You know, physicists tend to be more on the positive school. They aren't convinced about a lot of the things that have sort of come since then. They try to stick with that positivism, that only science is the one route to truth. And in general, our society also accepts that. But we've also sort of accepted this idea that science has failed, and that, you know, there's no objectivity to reality. It's all just has to do with the observer and the observed together. And we can't say anything really of reality. Right at the same time, and you can notice the time frame, but at the same time when the Frankfurt School existed and the Vienna Circle existed, you had the Inklings out there, and there are actually debates between the Inklings over at Oxford with people in the Vienna School and the Frankfurt School, which is really interesting. None of them were made public that I can find anyway, so it would have been really interesting to hear those arguments. But this was a literary discussion group at Oxford. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, was part of it. C.S. Lewis, who wrote Mere Christianity and The Chronicles of Narnia, was part of it. And they really had this integrated view of reality. C.S. Lewis wrote a lot about the medieval sort of view of reality and of knowledge and things like that. And that's part of the reason when you read C.S. Lewis, you get this really holistic picture of reality. You get this holistic sort of apologetic that he knew about, philosophy, theology, and the thinking that went behind, science. And they built these stories that really touch people's hearts that speak to something in people. When you read the Chronicles of Narnia or you read about Middle Earth and the Lord of the Rings, there's something deeply beautiful and deep about those stories. And so they left a legacy with their fiction and also with the apologetics works that C.S. Lewis left behind as he was dealing with the sort of philosophies of his day, and he was really thinking through them and he was responding to them. So this is a good example of where these Christians, a lot of them were Christians, were encouraging each other, building each other up, and they were producing content that was able to answer the objections and the things that were being said in the philosophy of their day. So finally, I'll go over this. This is Alvin Plantinga's Where the Conflict Really Lies. So he said there's a superficial conflict, but deep concord, so deep agreement between science and theism, between science and the belief that God created everything. But there's superficial concord, but deep conflict between science and naturalism. So in other words, actually, it seems people tend to say that there's a conflict between faith and reason, between Christianity and science. But he said, actually, it's only surface level that there's agreement between naturalism and science. But actually, there's deep, in the deep, like foundational principles, there's deep agreement between science and Christianity. But there's actually deep conflict. There's big issues between science and naturalism. And some of this you've kind of seen as we go through these different schools and you have the atomistic sort of view, you can see how it starts to sort of rip apart the idea of objective morality or objective truth, of objective knowledge. So he said naturalism plus evolution aims at faculties for survival, not for truth. So what evolution aims for, right, and its principle, what is evolution looking for in the idea of it? It's trying to produce something that survives. And that only entails that it's going to produce a sort of being that is able to survive better. It doesn't mean it's going to create a being that is going to understand and be able to put together things and understand truth very well. And so he said the goal is survival. So the probability of having reliable truth-aimed beliefs is low. So the fact of having truth-aimed beliefs, especially when it comes to more abstract things about like what is science and about the nature of reality and things like that, the expectation someone should have from that system of evolution naturalism should be low. It's not very likely you would have very reliable, ability to know truth. Ability to survive, yes, but ability to know truth, he said it's low. Adaptive behavior does not require true beliefs. You can believe a false thing about a lion. You can believe the lion is like a scary monster, and that's going to help you get away from it better. So false beliefs sometimes can help survival. There's no reason to expect true beliefs. Therefore, accepting naturalism and evolution gives people a defeater for the reliability of their minds. The probability of reliability for reliable truth-aimed beliefs, naturalism, evolution, given naturalism and evolution, is low. If our minds are unreliable, we cannot rationally trust the conclusion that naturalism and evolution gives us. So if our minds are not reliable, then we shouldn't trust the conclusions we're getting. We should doubt it. We should think that, there's a good chance that what we're thinking may not really be true. Why should we believe the knowledge that we're gaining? And so the conjunction of naturalism and evolution and science is self-defeating. If coming from a naturalist evolution way of thinking, that we should not have the sort of knowledge that we need in order to do science. So it's self-defeating. The theistic advantage is theism posits a rational God who created the Imago Dei, which provides a consistent foundation for believing our cognitive faculties are reliable enough to do science. And Alvin Plantinga talks about it as warranted belief. He says that we have warrant of the ability to form knowledge, for warrant for the confidence we have in forming knowledge, and the warrant in thinking that we have what's necessary rationally to be able to do science. And so that is best found within the divine plan of a creator who desires for us to know about the world he has created. So naturalism actually has a big problem, because the whole story of naturalism is about survival. But for science to work, the confidence that we need for science is that we have minds that are able to know about all kinds of things in reality, that we can explore about space and things that are not related to our survival at all, and that we have truth faculties that are able to explore those things and give us good knowledge about it. And as we see sort of from the story of science, when we just take it from a naturalistic perspective, we don't have confidence. It's very hard to have any confidence at all that about what's going on with the world, or about how things fit together. So that's a big head scratching sort of overview of where science has gone, where it has come from, and why the Christian worldview actually provides a greater foundation than the naturalist worldview. So intellectually, we should use Plantinga's challenge. We should challenge people that if naturalism is true, we don't have confidence. We don't have the confidence needed to really be able to put confidence in that there's going to be scientific progress, that we're able to explore and think about the things that we have. And I think people are coming more and more to this conclusion actually on their own, in a way, where you see this idea of cultural Christianity as a necessary ingredient for a lot of the things that we have in society. So people are actually realizing it, and we should point this out to people. Christians should be engaging design science and technology ethics, and just in general engaging in those fields of AI and bioethics, and what exactly in terms of technology, what can be advanced and things like that. I don't know, the human enhancement thing, AI kind of added that, but we should be at the forefront of this thing about technology. We should be, because within the Christian worldview, we have a good reason to believe that we can have strong knowledge about creating things and building that doesn't really come if you think of science as the one form of knowledge. And we should re-enchant science. So having this integrated form of knowledge, this way that we can really know things about the world, we can fit things together, and we can have a robust confidence about our ability to know, to help scientists actually see it as an act of worship. It's beautiful, that the world is beautiful, the creation is good, that it's worth exploring. This brings actually a light onto science that is being lost today. So I think we really need to highlight this in the culture, that Christianity actually has the ingredients to bring back the sort of light onto science that used to be there, that a lot of people in secular culture have lost that sort of motivation about science because their worldview doesn't provide the basis for it. And so, yeah, the Inklings, the Christians of the 18th century, like Jonathan Edwards, like John Wesley and the founding fathers, they show like a picture of what this looks like. The Inklings gives an example of what it might look like for a group of Christians to meet together and really encourage each other to engage in the culture in this sort of integrated knowledge sort of way. And Plantinga provides a really good argument and framework for why Christianity is the worldview that science is really and technology is really grounded in. Yeah, so that's the last slide here. Hopefully that's helpful and sort of understanding this whole picture is really helpful for me to see how it kind of fits together. I think the next step in that is really thinking through about how do we engage, the culture, and how do we think about everything as this sort of system again, think in that sort of systematic way that the founding fathers and other people thought of it as. Yeah. So any questions from anybody before we go?
I was reading in Gould, he said that the thinker was Rodin like 120 years ago, looked at contemplation and deep thinking like a skin diver, but then now we have the tweeter. It's like a jet ski on the top of the ocean, and you do 280 characters in a text, so people aren't really doing the deep thinking that they need to figure out what you're talking about.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. No, and it's this sort of anti-intellectualism in the society is that we don't value thought. We don't value getting into the details of things and really thinking about it. And I think that J.P. Moreland's point at the beginning that we listened to is really important for Christians to really grasp, because like he said, it's in the drinking water. You can't get away from philosophy. The philosophy of this secular age is what you believe because you're walking around in it, because you've been influenced by it. The only way to get out of it, and that Romans 12:1 of transform your minds, renew your minds through the word of God, is by not just reading the word of God, but by thinking deeply about these subjects and about how does the word of God shine light on these different areas. So it takes a lot of deep thought actually to come out of the cultural milieu that we're in every single day. Like we have to think deeply. If we don't think deeply, then we're going to think like a secularist. We're going to think like someone that doesn't see God in the world, because there's so many areas of thought we've just accepted from the society and the culture that we live in. So I think I think you're right on, Peter. And I think it's just something that we've got to come to terms with the fact that we aren't as sort of objective as we want to think. We're not just integrating the Bible with everything just naturally. You've got to do the hard work of thinking about, well, what is science and what is theology? What is philosophy? What are politics? Why is politics important? And you got to think about how the Bible fits in with that. What does the Bible say about those things? And then we can really have a cultural impact, because you see with Wesley and after him, what's his name? Wilberforce. Yeah, William Wilberforce, how he influenced like William Wilberforce, who ended slavery in England. Jonathan Edwards, who influenced the starting of these universities in America, the founding fathers. The amazing way system they were able to develop politically that no one has topped it. Since they, came up with the American political system, no one has created a better political system. And that's amazing. And that came from Christians who are thinking deeply about reality. So it's so important. So I think we've got to figure out how we communicate this to the churches, because most churches don't want to hear this right now. And that's sad. So, but yeah, that's what I had for today.
What's happening next week?
Let me see.
Oh, I may have to watch it on your tape because I'm going to a memorial service. It starts at 1 o'clock at Toro Park for a relative. So sorry.
No problem. I'll try to post this one on YouTube as well. So the next week is going to be about social justice and politics.
Wow.
Wow. I don't want to miss that, but oh well.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about that, and about a big part of the foundational part of that talk is about the difference between biblical justice and social justice. Or as Corey Miller likes to say, like there's a biblical view of social justice too, that is different from what we call social justice in our society today. So that's a big part of that one, is thinking through that and some of the political philosophy and why we have the political philosophy we do in the United States has a lot to do with really thinking through politics from a Christian worldview. So yeah, that's what we'll talk about next time.
That'll be a good one.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, I'll see you next week. I'll
Thank
post
you.
this, and then I'll send out the link if people want to watch it again, think through it.
All right, brother Tim. Thank you very much for the information that you shared with us today, my brother.
Really good.
Yep, no problem. All right, guys. God bless you. Bye.
God bless you, my brother.